Dorothy and Grandma's Fence. Dorothy was on her first visit to her grandparents, who lived in the country just outside a village in a very big house with beautiful grounds around it. Dorothy was having a strange experience, too, for her nurse had been taken ill just before they left home, and she had come away with her mother without a nurse for the first time in her life. She felt very old in the next morning when she went into the garden all alone. She was 6 years old and felt she was quite a young lady. On one side of the garden was a very tall fence, and Dorothy had never seen what was on the other side of that high fence, although she had wondered many times if it was where the world ended and the fence had been built very high so that her grandfather's house would not tumble off. This morning she determined to find out what was on the other side, and she walked down to the very end of the garden a long way from the house. The shrubs and trees grew so thick and tall she could not get through, and then there was an iron fence at the end of the garden, so she could not get out there. She tried to look through the high board fence, but the boards came closer together. There was nothing to climb upon, and even if there had been, Dorothy had never climbed in her life. So she just looked at the top of the fence and sighed, thinking she was never to know how the end of the world looked. One day she thought she heard voices, and asked the maid if there were any little boys and girls at the end of the earth, and if there were, how they held on. The maid laughed and said, "It may as well be the end of the world for you, miss, for if your grandfather caught you talking to those children, I don't know what would happen." And now Dorothy had a double longing to see the end of the earth, and also the children who held on and did not fall off. While she was sighing and thinking she was never to have her wish granted, she heard a scrambling sound on the other side of the fence. And while she was wondering what could be happening, a hand appeared and grasped the top of the fence. A curly head next appeared, and then a freckled face with a slice of bread and molasses held firmly between its teeth came into view. "Hello," said the girl, after she had removed the bread. "I almost bit off that mouthful and lost my bread. Do you like bread and molasses?" she asked. "I never tasted any," replied Dorothy, too astonished to say more. "You never tasted bread and molasses?" asked the girl. "What in the world do you eat?" "I eat bread and butter," replied Dorothy, a little nettled at the tone of her questioner's voice. "Oh, of course," said the girl, with a smile. "I might have known. But you know, we only have butter on Sundays. There are many of us that it would take a millionaire to keep us in butter, Father says. What's your name?" "Mine is Mary Jane Kennedy." "Dorothy West. How do you keep from falling off, and how does it look at the very end of the world?" asked Dorothy. "Oh, I just keep balanced," replied Mary Jane. But I don't know anything about the end of the world. Why do you ask me?" "Why, you live on the other side of the fence. I thought that was the end of the world, isn't it?" asked Dorothy. "Well, what a funny thing to think," said Mary Jane. "Of course it isn't the end of the world. I don't believe there is any end. You just keep going right around on it. It is just like a ring. There is no end to that. Why don't you come over here and see what is on the other side of the fence?" "How can I get over there?" asked Dorothy. "I tried to get around at the end of the garden, but there is an iron fence there." "What of it?" said Mary Jane, with scorn in her voice. "Can't you climb over that little fence?" "I don't think so," replied Dorothy. "I never tried to climb. Do you think I could?" "Of course you can," said Mary Jane. "You run down there and I will meet you in a minute." Dorothy heard a scramble and then the sound of running feet, and she hurried to the end of the garden, her heart beating wild with excitement. "My hands are sticky," said Mary Jane, as she appeared at the iron fence. "Wait until I wash them in the brook." And she disappeared, leaving Dorothy to wonder what a brook was, and how she could wash her hands without going to the house. She appeared again in a minute and said, "I expect you will spoil that dress. Couldn't you take it off and hand it over to me? If you scratch your skin, it will grow again. But if you tear your dress, it won't. So you better take it off." Dorothy would have thought as soon as taking off her head as such a thing an hour ago. But now she was ready for anything, and she turned her back for Mary Jane to unbutton it. "Can't you undress yourself?" asked Mary Jane. "Does your mother have to undress you every night?" "No, Mother does not undress me," replied Dorothy, wondering if she better mention her nurse. But she chanced it and said, "My nurse undresses me and dresses me, but she is ill, and that is the reason I am out by myself." "My goodness!" exclaimed Mary Jane, as she reached through the fence and unbuttoned the dress. "Do you have to have a nurse tagging about with you? Isn't it a shame you can't have a bit of fun? I know a girl in the village that comes here from the city summers, and she had never made mud pies in all her life. Her nurse won't let her get her dress mussed even. What do you think of that?" "There you are," she said. "Now take it off and hand it to me." Dorothy obeyed, and then Mary Jane told her to put her foot on one of the iron ornaments on the fence and give her hand to her. "Now put your other foot on the top and then jump." Dorothy's eyes were big with excitement, and when she landed on the other side she felt dazed for a minute, for she had never jumped from so high a point before. She stood up and looked around. It was not a bit as she had dreamed it would be. There were trees and water, the brook Mary Jane had spoken of, and two swings, and off on one side stood a funny little house. At least it looked small to Dorothy, who had never before seen a house with a low roof. "I wish you had an old dress," said Mary Jane. "You can't have any fun dressed up. I'll tell you, you wait and I will get one of mine. It is pretty bad, but it will be better than being dressed up." Dorothy felt she was in a new world as she looked about, and she wondered what Mary Jane meant by having fun. When Mary Jane returned with the dress, she was followed by her three sisters, and Dorothy hid behind a tree. "Oh, you need not mind my sisters," said Mary Jane. We often take off our dresses on a very hot day. My brothers will not be at home until night. They have gone fishing. This is Margaret, pointing to the tallest girl. And this is Barbara, and this is Susan. They are all older than we are, explained Mary Jane. I guess you're about my age. I am 6.5. I am 6, said Dorothy, as she turned for Mary Jane to fasten her dress. Just 6? Asked Mary Jane. How many months and days over? We all count the months and days because there are so many of us, and only a year between. I don't know, said Dorothy, feeling that her education had been sadly neglected. Oh, well, it does not make any difference with you because you have no brothers and sisters, said Mary Jane. Now what shall we play? Oh, let's play sending ships to a foreign port, said Margaret. We fill our ships with sand and play at sugar, she explained to Dorothy as she brought some little wooden boats from behind a rock. She gave one to Dorothy and a long, slender stick. This is to steer it with, Margaret told her. That big rock is the foreign port, and each of us must try to get our ship there first. Don't forget to make the waves, she told her sisters. Dorothy watched the others for a second and soon saw how it was done. But when her boat was sailing ahead, Mary Jane threw a stone into the water, and the little boats rocked and rocked to the very point of overturning. Stop! Stop! cried Dorothy, steadying her boat with her stick. Don't you see you are tipping my boat? That is the way we want to play, explained Mary Jane. You cannot expect smooth water on an ocean. Let's not have it too rough, said Margaret. This is the first time she has played, isn't it, Dorothy? For Margaret saw the tears very near to Dorothy's eyes. But in spite of the rough sea, Dorothy's ship reached the port first, and the little sisters were as pleased as Dorothy because she won the race. Dorothy's cheeks were red and her eyes were shining. One foot was wet, but she did not even know it. She was having fun for the first time in her life. Get in the swing, said Margaret, and we will take turns pushing you. You are brave to swing so high, said Mary Jane. I scream when my brother swings me as high as that. Dorothy began to feel very much grown up. She was without her nurse, and now Mary Jane thought she was brave. She had never been so happy before. Now let us make mud pies, said Mary Jane. Dorothy never made mud pies. We'll have to show her how. From under an old barrel turned upside down, the little sisters brought out spoons, old tin pans, and broken cookery. Dorothy did not see how they could have any fun with such things, but in a few minutes she was sitting on the ground, mixing pies and cakes, her pretty little hands as grimy as her playmates. Then presently a whistle sounded. Lunch time, said Margaret. That is the way Mother calls us, said Dorothy. There are so many of us, she could not stop to call our names. The little sisters ran to the brook and washed their hands, and Dorothy followed. And it was such fun to feel the cool water running over her hands and wrists. The little sisters shook off the water and dried their hands in the sun. Dorothy looked surprised at this, but she did as the others had done, and, to her surprise, her hands were soon dry. Stay and have lunch with us, said Margaret. Oh, do, said Barbara and Susan. She has butter on her bread every day, said Mary Jane. I don't believe she will like molasses. I should very much like to taste it, said Dorothy. Of course she will like molasses on her bread. All little girls do, said Margaret, taking Dorothy by the hand. What little girl is this? Asked Mary Jane's mother when they went into the house. This is Dorothy West, replied Mary Jane. She came from the other side of the high fence, but she is only visiting there, and she has never eaten any bread with molasses, so we asked her to stay and have lunch with us. Mary Jane's mother looked puzzled. Does your grandfather know where you are? She asked Dorothy. Dorothy confessed he did not, but she looked so sorrowful that the subject was dropped, and soon the little girls were eating their bread and molasses and chatting merrily. Then there were cookies and cold milk, and Dorothy thought she had never eaten anything so delicious. She felt sure she would never want any more butter on her bread. Molasses is much nicer, she told Mary Jane when they came out of the house. Oh, yes, you will, replied Mary Jane. Molasses is all right, but butter is good once in a while. Dorothy was introduced to a new game after lunch, and because she was a visitor and had never played at hide and seek, she was allowed to hide and not be it at all. Margaret covered her with the newly cut grass so that Mary Jane, who was it, had to hunt and hunt before she found her. And if Dorothy had not laughed, Mary Jane would have hunted still longer. Then all of the little girls took off their shoes and stockings and paddled in the water. Dorothy screamed when she first dipped her toes in, but the mud was soft and felt smooth to her feet, and soon she was ankle deep and hopping and hoping the day would never end. But it did end suddenly, for her name was called from the other side of the fence, and Dorothy knew it was her mother. Yes, Mother, answered Dorothy, the joy dying out of her little face. You come right home, said her mother. How in the world did you ever get over this fence? We have hunted everywhere for you. Mary began Dorothy, and then she stopped, for she suddenly realized that Mary Jane would be blamed. I'll come right home, Mother, just as soon as I change my dress. The little sisters helped her into her dress, and Margaret said, We better take her round by the road. We can't get a ladder, and she can climb up the fence, and then they can pull up one on the other side, said Mary Jane. That won't hurt her dress. The ladder was brought, and Dorothy climbed it, followed by Mary Jane. How will you get down on this side? Asked her mother. How in the world, Dorothy West, did you ever get on the other side of this high fence? I helped her over the iron fence at the end of your garden, explained Mary Jane, looking over Dorothy's shoulder. But I made her take off her dress first, and it is not hurt a bit. Please don't scold her. I invited her, or she would not have come. Yes, I would, said Dorothy. I was trying to look through the fence before you looked over, and I wanted to come over before you asked me. Dorothy's grandfather came through the garden, followed by a man carrying a ladder. And Dorothy was soon on the other side of the fence beside her mother. Margaret, Barbara, and Susan were all on their ladder by this time, looking over, but when they saw Dorothy's grandfather, they all disappeared, all but Mary Jane. She stayed to say goodbye to Dorothy. You need not blame Dorothy, Mr. West, she said to Dorothy's grandfather. I am to blame, And you need not be afraid that I will come over there, because we would not come on your ground if we had to hang by our arms to see a tree keep off of it." "That is what my brother Tom said. You won't scold her, will you?" Dorothy's grandfather looked up at Mary Jane's pleading face. "Which one are you?" he asked. "I am Mary Jane. I guess you never saw me before, because the fence was built before I was born, and before Barbara was born, too. It was when Susan was a baby, Tom says, and he and Jim were the ones who were really to blame. They sent Ned for the ball when it went over on your side. He was a little fellow and walked on your flowers. It must have been a long time ago. I never minded the fence until today, when I asked Dorothy to come over here and play. It is an awful long way around by the road. Goodbye, Dorothy. You will come again, won't you? 'Cause we can't come over on your side." No one scolded Dorothy, but she was asked many questions. And when the night fell, she fell asleep at the table. Her grandfather carried her upstairs in his arms and said to her mother, she had a good time like any other little girl for once in her life. I guess it is about time that fence came down. The boys are grown up now. It is a long walk by the road, as Mary Jane said. And if you will stay all summer, I'll have the fence taken down. The next morning, when Dorothy went into the yard, there was an opening in the fence where a board had been removed, and she looked through on the other side. "Mary Jane," she called. "Margaret, Barbara, Susan." The little sisters came running from the house. "Why, Dorothy," they gasped when they saw the opening. "Who did it?" "My grandfather had the man do it, and he is going to have the fence taken down just as he can get the men to do the work." "Oh, goody, goody!" cried the little sisters, dancing up and down and clapping their hands. "Won't it be just too lovely for anything?" said Margaret. "Now we can play all day, every day, and all you will have to do is go home to sleep." "Yes, 'cause we have only just enough beds, and I guess you will want to go home to eat after a while. You'll get tired of molasses." "No, I won't," replied Dorothy. "I'm going to have it every day if I want it. Grandmother had a pitcher of molasses put on the table this morning, and she said it would be on every day while I stayed." Dorothy stayed all that summer, and many summers after were spent with her grandparents. And always when it was time to go back to the city, Dorothy would plan what she and Mary Jane and the sisters would do when the summer came again.